Cool. Hello, everybody. Yes, welcome to a panel about Kubernetes. The idea was we actually got a lot of Kubernetes submissions of all kind of different people. So I said instead of using a lot of space in the sessions, because we want to have a lot of different diverse topics and track chairs together with the advisory committee, we said, okay, let's do a panel instead. So we brought all the people that submitted sessions or are using Kubernetes together, and they are all sitting up front here. So I'm very happy to have all the people here. We're going to let them introduce themselves. But maybe just shortly gauge the room so we understand a bit about knowledge. Who of you has never touched Kubernetes but has heard about it? Okay? Like touched as in not running a cluster. Cool. Okay. Who runs a development cluster? At home. Okay, yeah, that's good. And who runs it fully in production? Cool. Okay. Okay. So we have a good mix. So for the panelists to know, yes. So today we want to hear of different companies how they're using Kubernetes, why they're using it, how exactly they're using it, what is good, what was bad, and then we also want to hear a war story at the end. So we want to hear your biggest pain points or your biggest explosion or your biggest whatever you have, because I think we don't share these stories enough. So it is very new technology, and so we want to hear also how it fits. But first, let's do a short round of introduction, and please also state how you're using Kubernetes. So how is it managed? Is it not managed? All the different types of ways that we can run it. Yes, my own name is Michael. I'm the CTO from AZIO. I'm not going to talk too much today. I'm just going to do the moderation. So we're going to start with Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin Bridges. I'm the founder and CTO of DDEV by Drud. We use Kubernetes in production on Google Cloud. So it's not a managed service. We tend to offload as much of that as possible, but we do have several clusters running and a fair amount of production work happening there.
I'm Thom Toogood. I'm a systems engineer at AZIO, working with Michael. Based in New Zealand, and we've been using Kubernetes for about almost 3 years, and we currently manage the GovCMS implementation down in Australia, where they run a few hundred websites all on a dedicated Kubernetes cluster. So yeah, we've had quite a bit of experience running with Kubernetes.
Hello, my name is Florian Loretan. I'm CTO at Toogood, the company with a carrot. So we are using Kubernetes as pretty much everything from like creating projects for development environments all the way to production. And so like very heavy focus on like having a fully automated system that really enables like a really good flow of work for developers. So very, very heavy focus on the developer experience.
Hi, I'm Brad Jones. I'm a freelancer in Denver, so if you're looking for somebody to consult with you, I'm available. But I'm mostly captive the last year to an agency in Denver called Fruition, which is doing probably a transition that's familiar to many of you, like from sort of a weird mix of bare metal and hypervisors and God knows what to Kubernetes environment. So sort of a little bit maybe different from some of the other folks up here. Like we're not running a platform per se, like a commodity thing for sale. We're doing more of an internal product, but we've used this project to move everybody to a sort of unified Docker local development environment where we're running the same images locally and into production. And we are using Google Cloud, so we're taking advantage of a managed public cloud product, but we're also using Rancher as well, quite extensively with GitLab and doing some interesting things with authentication and proxying. So we can talk a little bit about that too.
Cool, thank you. So we want to jump right in, and the first question we want to know is like, how did you actually got started? Did you just woke up one day and said, I want to use everything in Kubernetes now? Or like, what was the process? How did it came from A till K?
So I guess I'll start. get the fortunate benefit of sitting next to Michael. So. I started basically using Kubernetes as a result of Drupal work. So it started very early in Drupal, and kind of rose with Drupal as Drupal gained more traction in the enterprise. So as the sites we worked on started getting larger and more complex, the needs to facilitate the transition to the operations team became more complicated and complex. As the sites grew in scope and scale and size, the servers farms that we were using started expanding, and we needed a way to very quickly and easily manage those. Eventually started working at Acquia as a cloud systems engineer, and saw a lot of things there that were very interesting to me, but decided to move on to more of an open source way of handling infrastructure, because I think there's a lot of value in open source and communicating with how we're solving these problems. Kubernetes is the largest open source project in the world, and it was an obvious choice as we started evaluating what to do. I think that the real challenge has always been timing it. We've known that we've wanted to use Kubernetes for a long period of time in production. We've known that we've wanted to use Docker for a long period of time in production, but timing it so that these technologies are mature enough and stable enough to be able to use has always been an interesting part of it. So for me, it's the bleeding edge, it's fun, there's a huge community behind it, and I get a lot of value out of that.
Thank you. Yeah, for me, it was actually probably 3 or 4 years ago, and primarily we're using more traditional hosting companies. I was working with them at the time, and found sort of Docker and Kubernetes or container orchestrators to work with continuous integration kind of thing. So we'd use it for mainly spinning up ephemeral environments, testing on before we deliver that out to a production site. But back then, I mean, people would say pretty crazy to run Docker in production. That's changed completely in the last couple of years, and even Kubernetes has changed completely in the last few years. So it's become a lot more stable, a lot more solid, and a lot more users. So the other thing that really interests me as well is the fact that it's an open source project. It's got a lot of backing from a lot of companies, and moving really quickly. And so some really good minds working on this great product. It's just really cool to work on it every day.
Yeah, so actually we are an agency, so our main work is actually building stuff, not hosting stuff. And for years we've been trying to find the right hosting partner that would just have the right process for us. And we didn't actually find that. We tried with many, and there was always something that it just didn't work exactly. So we have our own hosting infrastructure, like the traditional with virtual machines and so on. It actually works well. It's cost effective, it's stable, but what we saw is that pretty much the size of our operations team needed to scale linearly with the number of sites that we were hosting. And this was not, well, it's not very effective, and also it led to interruptions or delays. For example, you start a project, first thing you need to do is you need to ask someone to get a server, and this is something that we wanted to go past that, and really have a much more modern flow. And we started actually with using Container. So we wanted to use something that was simple. We thought that we had a very brief look at Kubernetes and thought, hey, this looks too complex, so we'll go with the simpler version. And when we, after a few months with the simpler version, we realized, hey, there's actually a good reason why all these complicated things are there in Kubernetes. Yeah, so we switched to using Kubernetes about a year and a half ago, something like that. And it's been, there's a certain learning curve, but it's really a lot of fun. And then the more you learn about those dedicated things, that new concepts and so on, the more you realize why those are needed. And that's actually been a very exciting learning process for our operations team, and it's really exciting to also kind of involve our lead developers, architects, into understanding what kind of possibilities we have, so that it's not only just Kubernetes as a replacement for another type of hosting, but really as a new way of thinking about applications, especially as we're moving away from just like hosting simple Drupal to hosting Drupal with different microservices, with different technologies, and seeing how they work together, how they're deployed, sometimes independently, sometimes synchronously, and so on. So it's really about enabling new types of development processes. And yeah, we still don't want to be a hosting company. We provide hosting just because that's what was needed to get the processes that we want.
Yeah, to the question of sort of like, how do you get into Kubernetes or what got me into Kubernetes? Like Docker is the gateway drug to Kubernetes, because Docker or virtualization with containers is really what we're talking about, and Kubernetes has won the orchestration debate, right? When I first got into doing containers, and especially like deploying containers, it wasn't entirely clear that Kubernetes was going to sort of win that, right? Like, in retrospect now, it looks like it was a done deal, but I started using a product called like Rancher, right? And Rancher 1.0 was its own thing, and it orchestrated containers on VMs that you provided it, but it wasn't entirely clear that Kubernetes was going to be it. But now we're at a place where it's very obvious that that's available, and there's great managed products from all of the public clouds. But I'd like to underline what Florian was saying, sort of about, it's not just about hosting, and it's not just about running workloads for Docker, or for Drupal, I mean. I think, it's a way for Drupal to continue to get off of the island, just like Drupal 8 got us off of, not invented here to, proudly found elsewhere. A good example of this is that sometimes Drupal's not the right answer for the thing that you're doing, or you need a complementary tool to play in with Drupal. And a lot of times I think we get very narrow-minded if we're like a Drupal shop and we do Drupal and we're going to solve the problem with that. A great example of this is something that I'm sure a lot of clients have asked you for before, like, we want to upload files and have like a directory of files for people to download, right? Like, there's no need to do that inside of Drupal, but Kubernetes and Docker allows developers, right? You don't even have to ask an ops person necessarily. Like, we solve that problem by deploying OwnCloud into a project, and we proxy through a directory, on that, and we let OwnCloud do. We can run an image that we get from Docker Hub, and it works great, and clients love it. So it gives us the ability to do that, or run Redis or Memcache or whatever. Like, you don't need to call an ops person to install this thing for you anymore. So I think this is a conversation more broadly about not just Drupal, but like empowering developers to build cool stuff because the virtualization allows them to.
Cool, thank you. So we heard about a bit of running your own cluster, using managed clusters. Maybe question specifically to Florian. You said you're using Google Cloud.
Yeah.
Have you ever considered running it your own? And what was the decision point behind that? Like managing your own cluster?
Well, actually, we started with Google Cloud because we wanted to just get up and running quickly. So we said, let's go with Google Cloud. It's best Kubernetes, like managed Kubernetes supports, also the most recent version, and so on. And then eventually we'll move to on-premise if needed. And we realized, actually, we don't want to move on-premise because there's just so many things that are taken care of for you. And yeah, it's just a very good ecosystem. And it used to be in the past that many clients didn't want to touch the cloud at all. It was evil, it was like everything. And then we see that the cloud ecosystem has changed quite a bit. So it's not like if you want a European data center, it's going to be in Dublin, and that's the only option you have. And for example, so like most of our clients are in Finland, and just having a data center in Finland, which is cooled by seawater, which is a pretty cool thing, unique data center design. So it makes a fun story, and suddenly it makes it actually a selling argument rather than us having to convince, look, the cloud is okay, and so yeah, we've seen a major shift there, and really the reason for going on-premise, I see, is like political reason, just policies, things like that. So like I don't really see a technical reason not to go to the public cloud.
Cool. Kevin, how was it for you? I think you went from self-managed to now managed.
Well, we started off with managed Kubernetes, and essentially, you need to make some really sound business decisions to understand that choice. I think typically, if you're a larger enterprise, you have a lot of virtualization already in place. You have a lot of compute resources available to you, then potential, and a large support staff to be able to, or operations staff to be able to manage Kubernetes. Then you might want to look at managing it yourself. Outside of that, I can't think of very many use cases where a managed Kubernetes instance makes a lot of sense. It's very complicated. You tend to be on the bleeding edge. You have better access to more complicated authentication algorithms. You get features maybe a little bit quicker, but by and by, the real benefit of not managing Kubernetes is that you get a lot of security updates. There's a consistent, stable base for you to build on, and it allows you to focus on what your applications are doing on top of Kubernetes instead of being caught up in the tasks of managing Kubernetes. Kubernetes is a complex system. There is no denying that, and taking it from A to Z essentially is very complicated for most organizations. It's not something that we wanted to take on lightly. We started off that way and learned very quickly that it's just much easier to do it managed.
Cool, thank you. So Brad, you mentioned before the gateway drug, Docker. If you could go back at the first time that you had that you started using Docker and thinking about Kubernetes, now with all the knowledge you have of running stuff, what would be the single thing that you would have loved to know before you started?
That's a really good question, but it's also, the goalposts move so fast, right? So when I started using Docker, and probably this is very similar to a lot of you, there wasn't even Docker Compose locally couldn't provide you a volume, right? You had to use a container that you sort of shimmed to be a persistent volume, right? So if you're going to get into the Kubernetes journey, I think the big thing is understanding that you're going to have to, if you've got a team that is not used to changing things, right? If your local development process hasn't changed in the last 5 years, your local developers are going to have a really tough time adjusting to that change. It's got to happen though. So it will accelerate the pace. So I think understanding, the biggest thing for me with Kubernetes is understanding the model and what's in scope for something that you should still manage yourself, right? Even on GKE, right, if you're a managed cloud, right, you still have questions about, should I use Cloud SQL, right? Every cloud provider has a managed SQL option. We elect to use it because running our own database, right? You could cluster a database in Kubernetes. It's something that we don't want to do, right? So you still have to make decisions about what do you want to get from your cloud provider, what do you want to self-manage. And I think the big thing that I'm seeing a lot of teams now struggle with is, and maybe Kevin's got some thoughts on this, the idea of your local development environment being like a Docker Plus kind of solution like DDEV, right? How do you, we've elected to run the same images locally in development that we then deploy into production. Some shops like to use sort of these composed images and then during their CI process build something that they deploy. There's not a right or wrong answer there, but it's worth thinking about because your developer teams have to then understand they have to understand more about the production deployment workload than they might if you're just used to sort of turning your code over to Acquia and having it run on a black box.
I have a good answer.
I knew you would.
To address the question of how do you get container parity between your local development environments and what's happening on production. There's a project out there that we're very, very much focused on right now to accomplish that for us, and it's called Cloud Native Buildpacks. Buildpacks are something that you might recognize from Heroku back in the day. It's a cloud-native project that's basically being run by Pivotal and Heroku right now. And Buildpacks allow you to circumvent or solve a lot of the shortcomings that you're going to find in things like Docker files. So a very quick example of that is, let's say in your local environment, you're running a Debian stack. You might want to put Git in there. You might want to put GCC in there because you need to compile something. You might want to put Node in there, and you put all of that in one container because it's easy. However, you don't want that to go up into production because that increases it increases everything. It increases your security vector. It makes you more vulnerable in a lot of ways. It increases the weight of your images. Buildpacks provide a mechanism to be able to take each of those layers that are put out by a Docker file, make them more programmatic and aware of each other. So for example, you can do a conditional step inside of a Buildpack layer that detects if there's a composer.json in there. If there's a composer.json in there, it will add composer, do a couple of different steps, and then allow you to delineate between what your build time environment is and what your runtime environment is. So essentially you can create different containers using the Open Container Initiative, not Docker specifically, but the output is containers, to run local development environments and run production level containers with a fair amount of parity. They're not exactly the same, but they do serve the same purpose, and they give you that assurance that what you're working with locally is going to work in production.
Follow-up question to that, how much is it usable? Like, on which state of maturity would you say it is?
We've reached full production parity with what we've typically done with Docker using Buildpacks. We have some example open repositories. GitHub.com/drud. I believe it's Buildpacks is the repo name, but we're using that in production now.
Yeah, I'm just going to continue and say that not only just from local development to production, but also through your CI environments and things. So you get that full congruency to be very confident when you're actually going to do that deployment. That what you're deploying is fully regression tested and ready to go.
It's also really helpful for security. The classic example that I use is if you build a Docker file, you might go through and include your base image. That might be Debian. You might add PHP on top of that, and then you do everything that you need for your application, which might be Drupal. If that Debian image ends up having a security release that happens, you have to rely on that maintainer to go through and do that security update for you, and then you have to rebuild all of your Docker files. If that doesn't happen and you want to deploy that security update, then you have to essentially fork the entire stack, pull that security update in, and rebuild all of your images. You're taking on a lot more technical debt, a lot more work. With something like Buildpacks, you have the ability to go through and rebuild the entire stack by just focusing on one layer of it. So worst case scenario, you go through and need to roll that security update to Debian yourself, then none of your other code needs to change. It's done in a very manageable way, and it's a fascinating technology.
Cool. I think that also brings us to another interesting point in Kubernetes, is the speed of development. Thom, how is it for you to how do you keep up with the speed of new things that come up and to use them and these things?
Yeah, I mean, it has been a crazy ride for sure. I mean, Kubernetes has been moving at an incredible pace. I think there are, about 3 monthly release cycles.
I need to contains the Kubernetes upgrade. Who wants to take a picture? Well, it's recorded anyway, so if you have it forever.
There are off-cycle Docker updates as well. So every day can be definitely challenging, but it's also exciting as well. I mean, there's a big community, and that's one of the most important things. So there's a lot of people working on these projects. The cloud native foundation is very impressive in terms of its scope and size and members and support. And so, it's definitely a crazy ride, but I mean, it's exciting as well to see that, over the last couple of years, to what we've gone from to where we are now, and things like Buildpacks, operators, there's a whole lot of new things coming out all the time. It's been a great ride, and I think it is just getting easier and easier, and especially with people like all of you guys actively working within the Drupal community. It's also great for the Drupal developers as well.
Who has like one resource or say that you would say follow that or read that every day to know, like, to keep up to date with Kubernetes? Or what are your personal like habits of staying up to date?
Well, actually, I think on one hand there's a lot of things happening, and at the same time I see that like there's a lot of effort that is being put into making sure that nothing breaks.
Mm-hmm.
So you can always update, and like at least for Kubernetes itself, there are certain things like Helm charts, for example, that's a whole different story. But it's there's the possibility to just stay, like, you don't need to, at least I feel like you don't need to read everything that comes up on this day or this week. You can leave your cron job beta 1 API definition, and it's going to work fine. And then so I don't feel like it's like I'm not feeling stressed about having to just always keep up, like the way that you would, for example, get in the JavaScript ecosystem. So this is something that I see that, yes, there's a lot of things happening. It's really exciting to see the new stuff that comes in, but I feel pretty safe about the stuff that's already in actually staying there and being quite stable.
On that point, I think there's the point of the question, I think, points to the pace of development with Kubernetes is so rapid that, like, if you want to do the latest hotness all the time, and you want to, like, I mean, I can't imagine right now, like, telling my entire team, we're going to convert to Buildpacks because, like, I just learned about it and Kevin's really into it. Like, it might be a really good fit, but especially if you're taking, like, I've been doing a lot of change management with helping to explain these new processes to developers. And I think, Drupal, we've gotten through this fog where there was a lot of angina about, like, we're not, this is not a product for, like, hobbyists anymore, right? Like, this is a very enterprisey product, and but we still have a lot of people, like, I'm self-taught, a lot of us are self-taught, like, you don't need a CS degree to do this. So I think flattening out some of that change, right, and understanding that if you have a Docker file that, like, builds today, yeah, you might need to make sure that you keep up with updates and that your upstream works, but, like, you don't have to be constantly fiddling every bit. But one thing that I've liked about what Kubernetes brings to the table, and more maybe Docker more broadly in containers, is that, like, I write more shell scripts today in like, everything old is new again, right? You have to understand you have to understand how the internet works, you have to understand how routing works. You will work with way more reverse proxies, right? Like, I write more Nginx conf files now than I ever did when I was using more sort of managed products from upstream. And that's a good thing, right? That's a really good thing that your developers can understand how all of that works. So I think if you take it as an opportunity to, like, we don't have to be learning about the new hotness, like, let's do a lunch and learn about, like, writing really great bash scripts, right? Because every Docker container I run starts up by doing a bunch of, bootstrapping. And that's a good thing, right? We don't have to, like, be constantly chasing our tail with the newest hotness.
Just quickly on that, I mean, there's been a recent sort of mantra in the community as well, which is just make Kubernetes boring. And I think that's been awesome, because it actually is just far more stable. I mean, early days, this thing was flying, and there was huge changes even in point releases. But now it's about making it boring, making it easy, making it stable. So making sure that what you run now is going to be running in a few years' time. There is going to be new updates, but you just don't have to take them on board straight away.
And for me, I think a lot of that answer relates in similar ways to Drupal. It's stay as close to core as possible. Integrate with the community. Kubernetes has a very strong community. Go to KubeCons. It's a fascinating experience. It's a very tight community. You have the ability to network and talk to people, to understand what's going on. Pay attention to the projects that the Cloud Native Foundation is shepherding, the ones that they're paying attention to, the ones that are incubating. Those are the ones that you should be focusing on. If you find yourself doing something like fighting an API, or you have some very specific thing that you're trying to accomplish because you're used to doing it a specific way, you might want to pause on that development effort for a little while and rethink the way that you're approaching it by exploring what the community is doing. In the Drupal Slack, we have a Kubernetes chat room. Encourage you to join that and start talking with each other there. We have a regular meeting that we try to do where we try to have this conversation with the Drupal community. So get involved, speak up, learn from each other. That's the best way to do it. And try to stay as close as possible to core, because varying away from that is going to leave you in a scenario where you might be drowned in technical debt, essentially.
So don't take core also in Kubernetes.
Yep.
And to answer your question, like one place to stay up to date, one thing that I would really recommend if you're using Kubernetes and a few things on top, for example, we use traffic for the ingress, just subscribe to the release notes for these projects, because each of these projects has like a really good process. Like new version comes out, there's a release candidate, it tells you what changed, and sometimes it's some bug fixes that affect you, but also very often it's new functionality that you think, oh, this is cool, I see where this could be used in our stack. And it doesn't come like an endless flow. You don't need to be like watching each commit individually, but those release notes are really really helpful. And this is something that I get a lot of my information that I actually need. I get it from there.
Cool, thank you. So let's go into the success stories world. So we want to hear what was like in the last couple of years something that you looked at and like was really like pointless, like wow, I didn't like imagine that this is possible, or something that worked really really well, and then after we do the war stories. But so Kevin, what is something that you can share that works really well for you?
I'm obviously pretty excited about Buildpacks. Those have been working very well for us. I'm also very excited about the operator controller patterns that have come out in Kubernetes, and the native way of communicating with the Kube API, and being able to extract, or basically give interfaces on top of the Kube API that we can expose to customers in a safer way. Has been very fascinating. So understanding our back, understanding the security controls, essentially has given us the ability to rapidly iterate. So if we want to bring Ruby onto the platform, or Java onto the platform, or any other CMS onto the platform, we have the ability to, in a pattern, to do that very safely and very effectively. And that pattern, all of these patterns combine to being able to onboard engineers quicker, to be able to help people understand what we're doing faster. And the faster and more efficient we are, the better we are for everybody. So I think that's been pretty fantastic.
Yeah, so from my side, I think, I see Kubernetes as a really great automation platform. I mean, it's the ultimate automation platform, declarative in terms of what you want. And one of the best success stories for us is actually a big migration project for GovCMS that we did late last year. And just over a weekend, we basically were able to migrate, I think it was 102 sites, around about that, just fully automated. Just basically kicked it off, ran. It took the whole weekend, mainly because of the transfer time. But to be able to do that and replicate that, and during that process, we're actually constantly testing and deploying and testing that migration process, and then kick it off and have that run through smoothly was pretty cool. The other thing that really excites me as well is the operators framework. I think that's just a really good model to be able to deploy objects and extend Kubernetes. So, I mean, some things I've been sort of looking into is the ability to have a a Drupal custom resource definition, so you actually can define your Drupal site as a single Kubernetes object, deploy that to a cluster, and the cluster sort of works to do with it. So it's something that I'm keen to talk about today at the Kubernetes box.
I guess, well, my success story is a bit on a different level. I guess, in general, like having a setup where, like, I see that our developers created projects and it's running, and I had absolutely no involvement. Our operations team also had absolutely no involvement, and it just happened. And I think the best one, so we had a bit of an emergency situation last week, and we needed a website very, very quickly. And so one of our developers actually created a new project from scratch, and so went from creating the first code to being in production with a domain and SSL certificates and being production ready 13 minutes. And that wasn't expected like that. I hope these kind of situations don't come up every week, but actually being able to do something like that, I think it's pretty awesome. And if you look at any kind of like the research that's done on the DevOps movement and the kind of key metrics, the time it takes you from writing code to having that code deployed in production, that's one of the leading indicator of productivity. And I think this is really pretty cool to reach these kind of numbers.
Yeah, I would agree. There's a lot of really interesting, cool stuff coming down the pipe, but the biggest successes are actually rather workaday. For us, very similar kind of experience where teams, when I don't hear from teams, that's really a good thing in the sense that we similarly use traffic, which is maybe it's a pain point and an advantage, but the ability for people to deploy a workload, especially for staging, it's super important to be able to like have TLS certificates for staging and test in an environment that is on parity. We don't have the same SLA for our staging environment, but we have the same infrastructure. And so just being able to go from a world where we didn't offer TLS for staging environments because we'd have to buy certificates, right? Like people are still buying certificates. Let's Encrypt, we'll give them to you for free, but you have to automate that. So automating out a lot of the pain for people, and even being able to do things like when a new database goes into our Cloud SQL, right? We've been able to use Kubernetes. It's not a Kubernetes feature, but we've been able to use a lot of that ability to deploy tiny services, right? We have a little service that runs on a cron job and uses Kubernetes primitives to back up databases, right? So we don't forget to put databases into our backup regime now because Kubernetes, something that we haven't talked too much about, is a great gateway drug for cloud native too, right? It's not, Kubernetes is just one way to get you into a cloud native environment. And so we now use object storage a lot more than we used to. We now use whole disk snapshotting, right? We use Valero for backing up disks, and we get disk snapshots right out of the box. Every persistent volume we have in Kubernetes just gets backed up. So that's been a huge, automation has been a huge factor for us. I don't have to set any of that up, so I don't have to forget to set any of it up. So now when we need a backup, we know it's there.
Cool. Okay, so last question for each of you. Now we want to go into the dark realm. So we want to hear about what was the worst that happened so far. Deleted clusters, lost backups, production sites down for multiple days. Who wants to start?
So we've actually been in production for a couple of weeks now, so no major horror stories, and all the sites that we have so far are relatively small. But one thing that's actually a simple way to break your cluster, just especially in development, sets a bit too much resource allocation. And you think, why would you get things to be slow by allocating more resource? And the problem is that we had those resource allocation for the PHP containers, but not for the underlying services that guarantee that the cluster is running. And so we ended up with those PHP containers just reserving everything, there was absolutely no load on the server, but it was reserving everything, and then the things that actually needed to run for the cluster to be running, they weren't running. And so we pretty much essentially locked down our entire cluster just by allocating too much. And yeah, so this kind of thing, it's very easy to do.
I've got two horror stories I'll share very briefly. One is even sort of pre-Kubernetes, right? Like the sort of a trope that the difficult problems in cloud native and especially Kubernetes is persistence, right? It's really every hello world tutorial in Kubernetes land is like, run a container, scale it up to 50, and it's load balanced. Look, it hits all these different nodes all at the same time. It's like, well, yeah, but I need to persist my files. How to, and it's like, congratulations, you're a Kubernetes expert, right? So that's very difficult. Or very early on, even pre-Kubernetes, I had just launched a beautiful new multi-site Drupal site. It was running in Docker, running on the client's infrastructure because they insisted that it be on-prem. And I persisted all of their persistent file storage in a directory that would not survive a restart. So the first day that node restarted, guess where all of their files went? Right into the round file. Didn't make that mistake again, but we've all made those mistakes for sure. The other piece that I will just mention, you will have to, if you're going to go on this journey, and even if you do managed Kubernetes, a big challenge is that you have to manage more of your infrastructure yourself, right? So a great example of this is on Ingress. Google's recommended way to do Ingress is to buy their HTTPS load balancer, and it's $30 a month per host, right? You can put multiple certificates on it, but you can't really, scale it out to multiple clients. So you have to buy a layer 4 load balancer and then do a lot of your ingress yourself, which is not a problem, but I'm not a TLS configuration expert. And so I have gotten a lot of heat from a CEO who's like, my wife runs Windows 10 and IE 11 or whatever it is, I don't run IE, right? And she gets a certificate error, right? Because you have to go in and manage a lot of that configuration yourself. You have to really be on top of, what ciphers did I select and that kind of thing. And we run into problems like that because clients will, we have a client that sells supplements to old people and they use really old Android phones. And we were using optional client TLS mutual authentication for some features and it broke all of that on Android. It just doesn't work on Android. And I didn't know for 3 months. And our clients telling us, we lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Who knows if that's true, but you will run into that because you don't get to point the finger at anybody else anymore. It's all you.
Yeah, for us, we've been pretty lucky. But it's definitely some days. But the great thing about it is the self-healing nature of Kubernetes, really. So you can actually lose that whole host and recover and stay up. But one of the probably the worst cases, or the interesting ones that we ran into, was just having Redis deployed in a high availability setup. And we thought, everything was tested fine. We were testing this sort of in one sort of availability zone, so latency wasn't so bad. But as soon as we switched that on to be highly available, so spread across 3 availability zones in a region, that network latency just caused massive issues. Sites were just running just so slow. And it was very difficult to work it out because it was hard to replicate because if the Nginx or WebPod was sitting on the same availability zone as Redis, there was no problem, but then if it wasn't, there was a problem. So, it was one of those things, there's lessons that you learn, that sometimes, Redis or Memcache is always a good idea with Drupal, but sometimes in a highly available setup, it can be damaging.
And for us, it's the very first large-scale deployment we did involved right around 200 or 300 sites. So we had gone through, and it was our initial implementation, which we tested, did load testing on. Everything was fine, and we were doing very static load testing across a wide range of things. But to Florian's point, we didn't quite have the resource quota set properly, didn't have CPU limits set properly. So once we got involved with the noisy neighbor problem, where one site was doing much more than everything else around it, suddenly the entire system just ground to a halt. So, I can't stress enough, take a look at your resource limits, resource quotas, take a look at your CPU limits, make sure that you're allocating properly for your machine. You can't over-allocate, it's hard, it's a difficult thing. You need to make sure that you understand what's happening there.
Cool, all right, that's it. Thanks for the stories. Thanks for being on the panel. That was it. I think if you have more questions, please reach out. As we heard, there is the Kubernetes Slack channel. Talk to Bob, and there's a Bob.
5:30 to 6 this afternoon.
Say again.
Yeah, we have a Kubernetes BOF from 5:30 to 6 this afternoon. So if you'd like to come by and talk about Kubernetes, we'd love to have you.
Yeah, cool. Thanks all. Have a good day.